which is going to be our discussion panel. We're going to invite Dallas, our other keynote Morby.
Could I get some water?
Yeah, of course. You can grab some water. Yeah.
I'll get my note.
I also invite my fellow postdocs at MIDAS, Efren Cruz Cortez and Elise Tulin, to be moderators in this panel with me. And without further ado, we're going to get your water and we can start. Thanks for your presentations. I think we can start with a question for you. Ian? Okay. Okay, so we can have the recording, everyone on the recording. So is ChatGPT conscious? That's not my opinion. I've been trying to know. Instead of consciousness, I want to ask about values, actually. So when we talk about, in your presentation, high quality text, in your presentation, when we talk about the democratic index, we're setting some, either implicitly or explicitly, some values with which we're judging whether it's a high quality text or whether it's more democratic or less. So we live in a plural society, and I guess my question is really broad, and it's like asking more, how do we take into account different values in society when making policy, when judging even in academia whether or not a model is good enough or good or ethical? How can we how can we make this happen? Is it even possible to take into account? Is it even happening?
It takes a while, right? Yep, should be good now. So.
Hello. Oh.
Introduce yourselves, please.
Okay. Do you want to introduce yourself very quickly?
Sure, hi.
Think about the question in the meantime.
I'm Elise Tulin. I am one of the moderators of the session, and I am also a MIDAS postdoc.
Yeah. I'm Efren Cruz, also a MIDAS postdoc, also working on ethical AI. I guess to continue Bernardo's question, what this made me think is, say, utilitarian values, right? Like with the advent of the utilitarian philosophy, it served as some sort of theoretical basis for the justification of capitalist practices, right? And it took a specific, say, mathematical form, right? When people started, say, maximizing utility functions and so on. And with that, it was thought that it would bring about the best to the most people, right? That it would improve, the conditions of the overall population, but it had instead unexpected consequences, right? That were dire for a large part of the population, right? And now when we're thinking about encoding our values in terms of, let's say, fairness metrics or the index, right, that you were talking about, sometimes these also have particular mathematical formulations, or they have particular forms as policies, as regulations, right? But the question is, could they have some sort of unintended consequence later on, right? Or, as Bernardo was saying, would there be some sort of direct conflict with the interest of other communities, especially communities that don't have much of a voice in the public sphere, right?
I start? Still working?
Yeah.
Before I start, can I give a big shout out? What was not mentioned in the presentation was the values encoded in machine learning research paper, one of my favorite papers. And it also was awarded Distinguished Paper Awards. Big fan of that paper, so let me put it out there, first of all. In terms of the values encoded in AI policy, in AI regulations, etc., you heard me mention the guardrails and red lines. Like the first question for us is, if you commit to human dignity, if you commit to human rights, if you commit to human centricity, what does that actually mean? Should you be deploying AI systems, certain AI systems in the first place, and who gets to who gets to determine that? So a lot of the talk about guardrails, red lines, prohibitions, bans, etc., means that where there is fundamental conflict with those rights and dignity, etc., or presumption of innocence, those systems should not be in place in the first place. I then move on to public interest technology and how we define public interest technology. And I think that should be a definition by each country according to their own cultural values and what the community and society in that country prioritizes and wishes to see in their society. So looking at that public interest, is there going to be a positive value? So you can roll out AI systems. We see that a lot with, for example, government and entities. Instead of expanding the space, for example, government benefits, government services, public interest, you see AI systems deployed, algorithmic systems deployed for fraud detection. How do we detect, for example, people trying to get access to resources, get access to benefits, etc.? There is space for that, but that should not be the leading value. That should not be the leading objective or the purpose of, for example, public actors. So I think looking at where the public interest is, where there is positive impact, and having meaningful conversations on who gets to decide is the crucial question. And I think there's where the value alignment can actually work if we are to deploy that system.
Yeah, I think these are huge questions to try and address. And it's just one example. It's interesting to point to like the scientific community as a sort of model for how ideas surface and are debated and things like that. In that there's sort of broad acceptance of anyone can potentially participate. In theory, you're evaluated on your ideas. There is a kind of adversarial standpoint, so things should be challenged as they go, but there's not a lot of, in principle, sort of barriers to entry, even though that doesn't always work well in practice. But for various reasons, that's not necessarily the best model for sort of society as a whole. And so, yeah, I think, you mentioned utilitarian values as sort of one thing that has been influential. I think maybe the most useful thing to point towards is human rights as a sort of fiction that has been incredibly influential, where we know human rights aren't actually fully enforced to the sort of statute, that there's many people whose rights are continuously violated, and yet it has been a very effective platform by which to advocate for various changes or incorporate voices because people have rallied around it as a kind of consensus objective. So I think, we do need to find ways to get broad voices in the room, but these sort of rallying points can serve, I think, to organize thinking, even though it's not sort of optimizing towards an outcome the way sort of utilitarian approach might be. So that's a first stab at it anyways.
Okay, so that was a bit more of a theoretical question, and we'd like to now ask you a little bit more of an applied one, but related to the policies. So in recent days, there's been a lot of talk about two potential approaches in the United States for regulation. It's a risk-based version versus the values-based approach. So we are curious about the pros and cons of each, and we'd like if you can think of pros and cons of each, but also what additional research is needed to be able to conduct, or that needs to be conducted in order to be able to advocate for one approach versus another. So, you guys.
This is really much more in your wheelhouse, I would say.
So risk versus rights-based approaches, first of all, you make a value, talking about value and priorities, you make a judgment, right? So interestingly, EU started GDPR, data protection regulation, which is a rights-based approach. So every individual has certain rights to access to their information, rights to know when they're being profiled, right not to be profiled, erasure, etc. When they started talking about the EU AI Act, there's been a shift to risk-based, and some of the preliminary work around that actually comes from German VDE, Germany data not agency, but kind of like the commission. So they came up with this pyramid idea of risk-based, like the pyramid of risk, etc. And that idea caught the attention of Singapore AI governance, and it just became a lot easier to explain, a lot easier to operationalize, and especially for a self-conformity, self-assessment regulation as the EU AI Act currently stands, it's a lot easier for the companies too. So there's a bit of lobbying. There's a lot of pushback on GDPR, so they're trying, I would say, a different approach that is going to be more corporate friendly. On the US side, there's a lot of, especially with the transatlantic alignment and what we talk about, that alignment, it is looking more and more that is going to be risk-based, and we're pushing more and more on the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, civil rights, and OECD AI principles that actually gives rights to people and obligations to the organizations. So one is, the risk-based one is very, I'm not going to say very, but it's a lot easier to operationalize. It's what the corporations prefer.
Is it because it's easier to measure to some extent?
There is that. Rights-based opens also a lot of other liabilities and responsibility and accountability as well. So I think there is a bit of what kind of liabilities and further responsibilities that is going to open up if it's another rights-based. So for example, if you put right not to be subject to an AI system in the regulation, how do you actually operationalize it? Do you have an additional alternative system in place just in case? Do you put like human determination? So it opens up for more harder, more resource-intensive implementation, I would say.
I don't think I have too much to add to that, except that I'll just say, I think it will be extremely interesting to see when these things are enacted, how they actually translate into practice. That sort of an outsider's perspective, it does seem like we wouldn't expect necessarily the best framework to be the one that succeeds, just because there's a lot of different influences in the room. And even the question of what is AI was phrased earlier during the Q&A. There is obviously a strong continuity or spectrum between AI technologies and just sort of software more generally. And so it'll be interesting if we see people trying to sort of position themselves as AI or not AI, depending which regulatory regime they want to fall into.
I have a question. So, something you mentioned in your talk that stood out to me is that you mentioned performative evaluations, right? And so I'm thinking, many companies, they will not want to look like the bad actor, right? So they're going to set up some sort of, fairness metric that their algorithms can follow, almost just as a performative act, right? But still with some sort of dangers that are not encoded in the metrics, right? I'm thinking, let's say, police surveillance, right? And maybe some company sells surveillance algorithms that satisfy kind of standard fairness metrics. But then Merrick comes and says, hold on, right? Here, ban, like all of police surveillance is actually problematic, or predictive surveillance, right? And we should ban its use, at least the AI use of that. So can you give us more examples of performative evaluations and maybe how discussions with policymakers have helped reshape the concept of these evaluations, how to improve them, how to avoid just having that in practice?
Yeah, just to add a quick thing to that, there is this danger of focusing obsessively on metrics, and metrics help us guide some decisions and summarizing into like a human intelligible way to make decisions, but there is also a danger of using them. Yeah, so I think it's related a little bit to the question.
Yeah, I think it's another great question. It reminds me a bit of the question about policymakers lagging actual practice in some ways and trying to play catch up. I think there is a way in which ideas of measurement get introduced, and then that's sort of the way to do things, even as things move on from there. So it's fascinating that a lot of this discussion of fairness in AI began with the ProPublica article on Compass investigating racial bias in criminal justice, which was a very sort of outsider perspective at a journalistic organization doing a statistical analysis. And this was, of course, something that the literature had discussed decades earlier, but wasn't really in people's awareness as a salient concern. And it's a sort of eye-catching example that drove a lot of the field to start looking this way. The example that came to my mind during your question was quite different, which is there's work from Google trying to develop a smartphone app that would help people assess skin conditions by using your camera to scan a piece of your skin. And they're clear this is not a diagnostic tool, it's not replacing doctors. They say it's sort of a search engine using visual means to find related conditions or things like that. And naturally, because people would be concerned about potential racial bias, they have an assessment by skin color to show that it's sort of similarly accurate across skin colors and so forth. But so as well as well-intentioned and as valuable as that is, I think it misses the broader point that giving people a way to essentially diagnose their own skin cancer will lead to a mass change in behavior of seeking medical attention, potential overdiagnosis, things like that. So it's sort of trying to catch up with a spotlight that's been put on one failure of evaluation while missing maybe the bigger picture. And so I think trying to, again, I have not done a lot of engagement with policymakers directly, so I can't speak as much to that side of it, but I think there is a tendency to focus on the very high-profile examples that have got a lot of media attention, and trying to look at or anticipate broader scale effects of these systems would be helpful to sort of be farther ahead of things.
And speaking of performative actions, you might have heard me at the very beginning when I was introducing the index. We said we wanted to compare the country's commitments versus their practices, right? There's usually a huge gap between what they say they want to do and what they actually do. So I respect human rights, turn around and they're deploying predictive policing or significant, human rights technology that is undermining human rights with refugee and asylum seekers, etc. So that was our starting point. You can extrapolate that, and when I talk about trustworthy AI with companies, I extrapolate that to the companies as well. Look at all the principles. Are you actually doing what you're talking? Are you actually walking the talk? So a lot of the performative action with those not all, but most, comes in the way that they define responsible AI principles or trustworthy AI principles. There are two ways that you can do that. One is you say, here are the principles, I'm going to change my business model. I commit to this, I will change my business model to respect these principles. I'm not going to sell facial mass surveillance technology, I'm not going to sell predictive policing technology, I'm not going to sell such and such, etc. AWS, Amazon has a zero carbon emission goal, right? There are a lot of oil companies as AWS clients, just to give an example. The other piece is you can say, and this is what's happening more and more, is these are my practices, this is my business model. How can I define the principles in a way that is not going to force me to change the business model? And that's where the performative action comes in. You put in this principles, looks great for PR, looks great for conferences. A lot of the times it's also aligned with CSR-like companies, social responsibility initiatives. It's not actually embedded into the business model. It is this philanthropic initiative. So it becomes even more performative. And they don't have to do much in terms of changes in how they do business, what they prioritize, how they build and deploy and sell these systems.
This reminds me of the sort of ability of certain companies or other bodies to extend beyond borders and therefore avoid some of the regulations. Like, for example, here in the US, I think you cannot use data from children, right? To make your algorithms for advertisement or whatever. But I mean, maybe there's a gray line. But I know that some companies go to other countries, buy the data that they have on children, and then they apply it to the products over here, right? Because of this ability to extend, and it's like, oh, it's not regulated over here, therefore I can still abide by the law, but just the law changes according to where I want it to apply,
Absolutely.
right?
I mean, you have the same company running multiple models for the same platform, for example, one for United Kingdom, which is not EU anymore, one for EU countries, one for US, one for other countries, like as expensive as their data collection and exploitation can be. Even in the US, one for California, one for Illinois, one for Vermont, one for Virginia, and one for possibly other states which do not have state-level privacy and data regulation. Coming back to what I was saying, if you commit to privacy, if you commit to certain principles, if you're honest about it, you can roll out the most rights-preserving, privacy-preserving models across all of these domains and not create 200 different models for the same thing.
At sort of a meta level as well, I guess we could look to, Murph mentioned the people who've been working in places like Microsoft very actively trying to get ahead of potential harms that are now sort of really taken aback by the way things have just rolled ahead without those considerations. And we might ask, was that whole thing performative? Was that whole team sort of there as a cover? Or is it that realities change or leadership changes or things like that? Presumably many of the people involved had very good faith intentions. But again, things can change quickly. And so I think evaluations can play multiple roles. Some of it it almost always provides some information. It may not be capable of delivering the true promise. And some is always probably at least partly performative, but it's rarely going to be totally one or the other, I think.
This is also kind of reminding me of some of the predatory practices we talked about actually during your symposium. So please come to these if you're part of the Michigan area. Please keep coming to these. These are great. But the fact that companies can buy, like when a company goes bankrupt, if they've been collecting data, they potentially can sell their data. That's an asset. It's a way of kind of closing out. And how that might integrate within, we're talking about like large like language models and things like that. How much of that data is, data that's been kind of shared beyond the parameters of initial agreement, right? If a company collapses and then sells your data, like we don't have great regulations around that. And so it's beyond privacy. It's also that vulnerability and the intention of the data when you first agree to it, if you even read through the terms of service, it seems like. So I'm curious about your, like how do we as researchers like integrate, our work to show areas where, there is kind of violations occurring and kind of these predatory acts? Because I agree, yes, I think there are good people in companies, but ultimately like there's quite a bit of predatory behavior going on.
Could you just restate your question again? I'm not totally sure I see.
Yeah, I'm just curious about like the types of research. So you've done amazing research looking at, these large language models and trying to figure out kind of like the performance and all of that. And I guess my question is, like what other research do we need to kind of reduce the predatory nature of companies? Like, is it that we have to get public information, like the public better educated? Is it educating policy members? Is it continuing to run these, important studies and showing this? Like, where are we within this framework and how do we create this change?
Yeah, it's really, I think it's hard to, I certainly don't have a simple answer for like trying to change corporate behavior or anything like that. This is obviously something that's driven by all factors of the economy, both sort of high level regulation, but also on the ground, like demand from people. I think of one example of, Clearview AI, which tried to develop facial recognition software or facial surveillance software based on images scraped from social media. This was like a pretty clear case where they clearly violated terms of service in gathering this data. They sort of didn't try to go through normal standard channels, but just tried to sort of optimize for sales in various capacities. And so I think there's cases where police departments were operating in states that had essentially banned this sort of technology, and yet individual police departments or officers had gone out to seek this software for their own sort of purposes. So in some sense, that company was filling a need that was arising from individual levels. And I think a lot of the same thing can be said across the board. So, maybe we think of something like education, where there's companies set up to provide for-profit education. They are offering some service, and people, they're offering something in return. Whether that ends up being predatory or not may depend on how effective that ends up being. So it's not necessarily something that's a priori good or bad. I think it's going to depend on certainly we need assessments to measure whether things are actually delivering on their promise. We need certain places where things will simply not be permitted. But we do need some space, I think, as well, for people to offer alternatives to people that individuals may want to purchase. There may be cases where we do want people to allow, there will be demand for things like AI companions of various sorts, and so whether or not we want to sort of ban those or limit them in certain ways is a sort of broader conversation. And I think we do need at least some sort of experimentation there to allow for multiple things we could imagine. So it's not a very good answer, but yeah.
I know the
We're gonna
audience
start
has.
opening for questions, but in the spirit of opening for questions, we have in the registration of Kyle Manley. I don't know if Kyle Manley is here. They left a comment in their registration, which is kind of a great question. We found to be a great question to you, and hopefully useful for students. How can academics, early career scholars, and students effectively reach and collaborate with policymakers to develop and promote ethical AI? What incentives can encourage more dynamic and diverse collaborations from policy and academia? Do you have any advice for us early scholars or early researchers, early career researchers?
I think one would be kind of talking about this in the classes as well, especially. All of us have talked in ethics classes, like applied ethics classes in engineering and other disciplines. We're seeing more and more. Michigan has been one of the leaders in this space. We're seeing it in more and more campuses. I think we can also look at multidisciplinary collaborations within the departments of each university, whether that's the public policy school or international relations or political science schools. You mentioned that within the engineering code of conduct, etc., that there's an obligation to public interest. I would be very curious about how the engineering curriculum defines that public interest, and what are some of the ways that engineers go about figuring out what the public interest is and how do they collaborate. So that would be one thing. We at the center have been running for 3 years now. We just finished the 5th semester-long AI policy clinics, training AI policy education, and we try to bring researchers, lawyers, policymakers, practitioners, civil society advocates together, talk about these policy frameworks that I mentioned, look at it from cultural angles, so it's not so US West-centric, look at it from implementation angles, look at it from human rights and democratic values, and kind of expand that space of discussion. First, build a network, expand the space for discussion, but also give them a chance to take it back to their companies, take it back to their governments, etc. To say, here is something that is already in place. Can we implement this? Can we discuss about this? Can we look at different ways of the AI systems and algorithmic systems that we already have in place, or collaborating with universities and labs? I think one is literacy. The other is definitely more collaboration across departments and policymakers.
Also, just concretely, there's a number of excellent programs out there. For example, one called Tech Congress, which tries to embed people as sort of temporary staffers in member of Congress offices, those who are specifically interested in sort of various parts of technology. And I expect there's probably a lot more demand at a local level as well, where the highest levels of government have access to experts when they need it more readily. But I imagine at sort of either state or city level, there's probably an even greater lack of knowledge of certain issues. So how to establish those connections, I'm not sure, but I think just going and talking to people, having conversations is a good starting point for it.
Thank you. Do you have any questions you want to ask our moderators?
We have a microphone here.
Yes.
I actually got a question for you.
All right. So question is for both or either of you. In terms of thinking of democratic values and talking about companies and corporations and hoping that they follow democratic principles and human rights in their AI practices, something that sticks out to me is that most companies and corporations in general are not democratic. They're not democratically organized or have any sort of democratic structure. They can performatively talk in the language of human rights and democracy that we share, but we did say that that is very performative. How can we incentivize or incentivize companies and corporations to do the right thing? And a lot of this is also couched in 2016 election, which was before we had generative AI the way it is right now. That election was really influenced by the actions of certain companies such as Facebook that did not do the right thing in terms of preserving democracy. What are some perspectives going into the next election, the first election where we have these corporations that have immense political power and we have generative AI largely unregulated because of the power that these entities hold? Thank you.
So in terms of democratic values, I was referring to democratic values within a nation, not so much within a company. I wouldn't go there. I mean, we can talk about governance mechanisms like AI governance within an organization separately, but when we say democratic values and respect for democratic institutions, what does it mean? It means plurality. It means the society has a chance, either through voting or public consultations or engagement, to show what is it that they want to be governed by. The public has a chance to establish the norms, or the society has a chance to establish the norms. So it's not an authoritarian, you're going to do this, you can do this, you cannot do this kind of government. That you have elections, we have plurality. So those are all democratic values that we look at. And where is it that the governments and the companies, what are their role in terms of nourishing those democratic institutions, protecting those plurality, public and societal engagement, elections, access to information is another one. So how can you nourish that? When it comes to what you were mentioning about the company's own responsibilities, I'm glad that you mentioned the generative AI piece. The same company who has unleashed multiples of them, I'm not just going to pick up on OpenAI, but same thing with Microsoft and Google as well. The same companies that have unleashed these technologies are also saying, hey, there's a huge chance of misinformation. There's going to be a lot of deepfakes, there's going to be a lot of misinformation, 2024 is going to be the last elections, etc. So you cannot have it both ways and then call yourself responsible or shield yourself from accountability and liability. So I think there's also a piece about democratic values that requires accountability. So society can pass laws through their elected members to keep them accountable. So when I say democratic values, it's the bigger picture. But I think within the organizations, and I'm going to stop there, the governance mechanisms should also allow for anyone in the organization to raise flags, raise concerns. It should not come to whistleblower protections. That's the nuclear option for me. A company who's serious about this should have the governance mechanisms and incentive alignments, value alignments within the organization, so it never comes to whistleblowing.
I certainly agree that most corporations do not act democratically or not organized democratically. You probably work with aware of the work of Elizabeth Anderson, for example. But it's worth remembering that lots of the parts of the government are not really democratically organized either. And I think generally speaking, we would expect all kinds of social systems to involve a number of different modes of organizing people and sharing information. And so I think, I can't really add much to that. I think, we do need ways for people to set frameworks within which individuals will operate. But I think trying to expect all companies to operate democratically is probably not really a practical way forward.
We have another question here.
Is there any concern with these large language models and a loss of competition? I'm just thinking about Google has, say, 90% of the market share of the search engine market. Is there anything being done to promote competition within, say, these large language models and other kind of machine learning? And should there be something done, if not?
That's definitely outside of my realm of expertise. I think we've been thinking for a long time, the classic model is the corporations get large enough and eventually lose their edge on innovation and something else comes along. One example of this, of course, is video conferencing, where you could say Google had every single possible advantage to dominate the video conferencing market. And it just so happened the pandemic came along and Zoom was right there and had a better product. And I don't know how profitable they are now, but they certainly seem like they are still a better product in some ways, and certainly are probably more popular. When it comes to search, it does seem like ChatGPT has been the greatest disruption to search in a very long time. What the long-term effect that will be, I don't think we know yet, because Google has very similar technology and may be able to regain a lot of that attention. Whether we want to promote more competition there, I think there are some industries where it seems like centralization is not necessarily inevitable, but costly to resist, let's say. So, we can look to semiconductor manufacturing is the classic example. So certainly I think there's concerns about, lack of competition across the board on all of these things. I'm not sure search is the one that we should be most focused on necessarily. And there are some interesting alternatives out there. But yeah, I'm excited to see what happens in the coming months for this.
Thank you. I have a question. You shared a list of the different additions and modifications made to the EU's upcoming AI policies, and they included several provisions about different types of privacy, et cetera, et cetera. I'm curious if there's a human right around AI that perhaps wasn't practicable in negotiation or wasn't going to be workable with the different stakeholders, but you nonetheless feel strongly about, both of you, that you think might not be something that we can argue for in a policy space, but is still something that we should be thinking about and feeling for, at least.
I think if you're talking about human rights, we should fight for it. that we shouldn't step back. One, I would just put it out there. And then the second piece that we see a lot is this balancing term. Let's balance human rights with innovation. No, human rights comes and innovation should be done in a way to respect human rights, human dignity, and human flourishing and environmental protection. So I think it begs for better innovation to make sure that all those rights are protected and are nourished as well. One thing I would say is you saw in a lot of the bans and a lot of the exclusions, there is a lot of government use of AI that we talk a lot about, like the private companies, what they deploy, etc. But government is also one of the biggest purchasers, clients of AI systems, and it's only increasing. There's huge purchasing power, procurement dollars for each government. And how they deploy AI systems, I think, is going to be one of the bigger questions on impact on human rights. How do you deploy it for at the borders in terms of access to healthcare, access to government benefits, access to education, and secret, like overall systems. And one of my personal research focus areas is, trustworthy AI and public procurement of AI. So what kind of like guardrails and protections and considerations there should be for public procurement, because you're putting trillions and trillions of dollars into this across the world. Whether a small client does it becomes a smaller question then.
And this isn't quite an answer to your question, but I guess I'll just say I do think a lot about sort of the loss of imagination or aspiration, that certainly within NLP, it's amazing how much everyone has congealed upon one mode of working in some sense, because that's proven to be so effective. And I think there is a lot of concern about sort of lack of diversity of ideas in some sense in that space. And more generally, although clearly it is very important to get things right with these technologies, we should keep in mind that AI is not everything. That there's a huge amount of the world that is interacting with computational systems in various ways, but there's a lot of other issues that we should keep front of mind as well. So I think there's some fear that so much attention is being focused on this issue right now that there may be other interesting avenues to try to improve the world that we could be focusing more attention on as well.
Thank you. Time for one last super quick question and quick answer. No? Are we good? Okay. Thank you so much. Okay, go ahead.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Well, so I was thinking, let's say we give AI a chance, right? And, we know humans were very flawed, right? Without the help of AI, we have designed a lot of, institutional bodies and forms of organization that have caused harm, and even certain practices that cause harm without using AI, right? And a lot of these bans that were listed, for example, were practices that could still happen without AI, right? And even without computation, right? Either from human biases or from certain institutional biases that are already in place, right? So the question, and maybe going back to Jenna's talk, where she said, you have the physician, and then if they receive the help of a good AI, in a sense, then their performance can improve, right? If they receive the help from a bad one, then of course it goes down, right? But the question is, and since you two are, I wouldn't ask this question to some sort of app platform magnate, but since you two are very grounded, right? I'll ask you, do you see, Dom, some good potential for AI, right? Like, are there cases where maybe if we were to design a good AI, it would be better than the current human state of the art, if that makes sense? Does that make sense? And then can you give us some examples of that?
Definitely makes sense. I would say in many cases, what we talk about with AI, includes many different things, but again, it's in many contexts, especially governmental context, of a piece with sort of rulemaking and software more broadly. And so, as you say, it's, we can sort of abstract away. We can obviously make better rules than we currently have. There's often a status quo bias to things that the way things are is the way things should be. And I think we can almost always do better. But we're talking about socio-technical systems that, the idea that we can design a perfect system that will never have any flaws and never need to change is obviously an illusion. So I just think all of this is sort of ongoing work where any system, whether human designed or incorporating AI elements, will need maintenance and updates and work as we go forward, as people adapt to it. So I think things are, to some extent, here to stay. I think we will see many benefits that come with this, but it'll be just a constant battle to keep advocating for what we think of as the ethical way forward.
I really like the use of AI in exploratory research and exploratory conversations within organizations. So look at AI. I'm going to caveat it, you're still looking at quantifiable data. So qualitative data is still on the side. Take it with that caveat. You can use exploratory AI to look at what's happening in your organization. Let's take recruitment or a workplace as an example. Who are we hiring? Where are we hiring from? What kind of people with kind of backgrounds are we hiring? once they're in the organization, who are we promoting, providing more training, career opportunities, mobility opportunities? Who is exiting on the other end? Are certain groups leaving the company at higher rates than others? Why is that? Use AI to kind of do that exploration, not for decision making of who should be terminated. Once you have that exploratory data, bring in stakeholders and impacted people, and have humans still make the determinations of how to improve and how to, make that. Are there wage gaps across your employees, etc. So I think there's great opportunity to do there, to use it for exploratory purposes. There are some great use of AI for like remote health, access to health, where in really rural areas where you just don't have the means to see a doctor, or the doctor doesn't have the means to come to you or send prescriptions, so they're using drone technology to get like blood transfusions and medication, and using telehealth to connect the doctors. I think there are great opportunities there as well. But again, I keep coming back to who's benefiting from it, who's being harmed from it, who makes the decision, and where is the public interest, where we are prioritizing these technologies.
Right. Thank you so much for the panel. So we're now